Hey everybody, this is Serp Kerp and my friend Terilien. And recently, or in the past few months, both of us have read The Triumph of Christianity by Bart Ehrman. Terilien has read, is it 2 or 3 other books on similar subjects?
2 other books, and I also did, a lot of article reading on the subject.
What were those books, the other 2 books?
The other one was Pagans, The Decline of Traditional Religion and the Rise of Christianity, and the other one was Ramsay MacMullen's Christianizing the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm. So basically this discussion is going to center around the Christianization of the Roman Empire from the 3rd to the 5th centuries, right?
Yeah, and the decline of paganism, how it happened, why it happened.
First of all, I want to say Bart Ehrman. I know a lot of people that are Christian dislike him. He was an evangelical apostate from Christianity who became part of the Higher Criticism Historical School and lost his faith of biblical scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
And he's pretty famous for having. He's a very good. The thing with him, he's a very good scholar. At least very good mainstream scholar, and he writes at a level which anyone with a high school education could understand. So he's very accessible and very scholarly at the same time, which is very rare.
Yeah, and I'm also going to add, it's, a lot of Christians would say, well, everything he's saying is wrong, so how can you be a good scholar? Well, his conclusions make a lot of sense if you are, 1, a naturalist, and 2, if you lack the kind of ecclesiology that the apostolic churches have to cope with all the textual variants in antiquity.
Mm-hmm. And there's something else. This book, in the conclusions that he raises in this book for the ultimate triumph of Christianity, if you will, that is he an agnostic or an atheist?
He is an agnostic atheist.
For an agnostic atheist to put on pen and paper is mind-boggling how pro-Christian his conclusions are. Essentially, he just dismisses his conclusion as just something he has to accept. That's just what the data says.
Yeah.
That conclusion, his personal conclusion, is that the popular belief in miracles within Christianity is what led Christianity to grow rapidly within the Roman world.
And I at first could not believe my eyes, but I read the much more hostile book, Christianizing the Roman Empire by Ramsay MacMullen, and also the book Pagans. And they both basically conclude the same thing about Christianity and how it was the popular belief in Christianity's miracles that drove conversion.
The thing about this, which is so amazing to me, is that pagans didn't have a sophisticated understanding of the afterlife, right? But they definitely believed that gods intervene in day-to-day human affairs. They definitely believed in miraculous and supernatural. It wasn't as if this was a new addition and just people just talking. It was like this new cascade of a preference cascade. Of miracles are cool. This idea of miracles is cool, and they didn't happen.
Oh no, pagan religion was very theologically underdeveloped, but it was almost entirely focused on rituals that were meant to have the gods bestow divine favor on one. Miracles, omens, things like that were absolutely central to pagan thinking. And then, in a sense, Christianity provided what pagan religion was traditionally meant to provide, but at a much higher level, at least in the minds of normal people.
I mean, Rodney Stark, I'm going to change a little bit. Rodney Stark's reason for the triumph of Christianity, or the Christianization of the Roman world, wasn't it how committed Christian communities, how strong that they were?
Yes.
How their charity towards one another was very appealing.
It's ironically much more secular than Bart Ehrman's reasoning.
Mm-hmm. And Bart Ehrman doesn't have that opinion. I believe it is both, but that was Julian the Apostate. That's what Bart Ehrman quotes Julian. Julian the Apostate says, or maybe he doesn't. He talks about Julian the Apostate. We have to combat Christianity by creating a paganism which focuses on communities, which is
and on charity and all that.
Which is very breathtaking. That, where you have a source that says that. Where Julian outright says the Christians are more charitable. We have to become charitable pagans.
So basically, if I can put a bit of a timeline on it, when the apostles die, not when the apostles, after Jesus dies and the apostles go out into the world, there are numerous accounts of them performing many, many great miracles. You have Peter's duel with Simon Magus in Rome. You have Peter's shadow healing people. You have mass healings in public. You have exorcisms and things like that.
Well, John gets thrown into a boiling oil?
Mm-hmm.
And he's miraculously unharmed.
Yeah. These accounts continue well into the 2nd and 3rd century. And It was a major reason why people converted and why they thought it was so compelling.
Here's something else. As they always said, martyrdom draws people to the faith, but this is kind of confusing, right? How would seeing somebody die? Well, if you go back into early Christian histories of martyrdom, the way that the martyrs died was highly, highly supernatural and would be of course miracles in and of themselves often.
Yes. I think another thing to add, another reason he gives is that Christianity was exclusive. And so an example he gives is, let's say you have a devotee of Apollo and a devotee of Jesus in front of a crowd of pagans. And the devotee of Apollo convinces half of them, and the devotee of Jesus convinces half of them. Paganism will have gained no one because it's not exclusive, whereas Christianity will have gained a bunch of people from 0 people because it is exclusive and demands exclusive devotion.
Well, if we go to the Eastern world today, if we go to China, people are simultaneously native Chinese pagans, Confucians, Taoists, and Buddhists, or they're simultaneously Shinto or Buddhist, simultaneously native. I don't know what native Vietnamese religion is called, but the native Vietnamese paganism and Buddhist and Confucian and so on and so forth. If you go to India, your dad could worship Shiva, you could worship Vishnu.
Yeah, and I mean, pagan tradition wasn't one thing. It was many, many, many things, just sort of cobbled together loosely or not so loosely. And you would basically adopt whatever gods, were proper to the state or city you lived in, and also whichever gods you personally thought would help you with your various ventures or concerns. Occasionally, you did have some people who had a very, very deep devotion to one deity, and so saw all the good of other deities as coming from that deity. But
isn't the development of henotheism rather late?
Yeah, and it's also not particularly radical in most cases. I mean, it doesn't.
Exclusivist.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't demand exclusive worship the way Christianity did, and so that was a very immense structural advantage that Christianity had.
Well, so his description is if a father becomes Christian, and his family converts because of the authority that he has over his family in the Roman world, then all their children from that point on are going to be Christian if they're baptized because of the exclusiveness. So you have this generational growth effect to where the exclusiveness grows people outward.
Which, is compounded by the stronger cohesion and sense of community among Christians.
Well, Christianity, Hinduism has eventually become this way, but Chinese and Far Eastern religions aren't this way still, like the Roman religion is. And in the sense is that in the Roman world, morality, philosophy, faith in the conception of the afterlife, conception of the supernatural, interaction with the gods, these are all separate entities.
They're all independent.
They're all independent. For modern Christians or modern Abrahamics, and Hinduism's become this way too, to understand that someone's moral framework isn't necessarily part of their religious views or even their understanding of the afterlife is not connected to a religion is very bizarre. And Christianity is a total Christianity and all Abrahamic religions are maybe even Middle Eastern religions. Maybe this goes back into Egyptian paganism itself. Are totally all-consuming for one's life, where you have morality, you have philosophy, you have day-to-day interactions with the gods, you have the explanation of all supernatural activity, and you have the afterlife. They're all integrated into one faith. Oftentimes, they're even all politically. Most of the time, they're politically integrated historically.
Yeah.
Too.
I think another thing worth mentioning is the accusation that Christians basically just used force to convert the empire.
Oh, the pagan accusation?
Yeah. I mean, that's especially common in these circles.
Bart Ehrman does talk about Christian persecution and paganism, but we have to remember is that within Roman law itself, it was a complete absurdity to persecute for someone for being a Christian, because you legislate laws against actions. So there's nothing to punish somebody for. So what they had to do to punish people to execute them for being Christians, unless it was mob violence like Nero's in 64 AD after the Great Fire, it was like emperor-directed mob violence. But most of the time, they command everybody to have an obligatory sacrifice. And because of the exclusivity of Christians, they wouldn't do it. Because they refused to do the sacrifice, they'd be killed. When Christians took over, they never persecuted pagans on an individual level. There would often be mobs that would destroy pagan temples or destroy idols, but the individual pagan was never attacked centrally. He'd only be killed in mob violence. And they looked the other way during the destruction of temples, but the persecution that Christians had towards Roman paganism legally didn't exist. They were discriminated against in terms of property, and mobs would often destroy their property too, and they would take a blind. They'd look at it blindly. But if we compare it to the persecution of Christians under the Roman Empire, persecution of Christians under Japan, persecution of, say, Catholics under the English monarchy, it's completely different. The personal beliefs were left alone.
So just to add to that, so Christians were persecuted, although not as Christians, but for not participating in the Roman religion, right? And this is because it was believed that sacrifices were necessary to avert things like natural disasters or defeat in war, right? And also, if you didn't go with a certain omen that you found in entrails, it was considered to be another portent of disaster. When Christians took over, at first they mostly left them alone. Constantine did shut down a few temples, but one does have to understand that the authority to shut down a temple or repurpose a building or something like that is something that the emperor had held throughout imperial history. He did not engage in any kind of systemic persecution. Now, you do start to see legislation against pagan practices like sacrifices under Constans and Constantius and things like that. But there are two things to note about this. One is that, practically speaking, it couldn't really be enforced. Two, it was, very much like the pagan persecution of Christians. Three,
No, it wasn't like the pagan persecution of Christians, because Christians were persecuted for their individual faith. Pagans were not.
Yeah, what I mean,
the structure, their property was attacked, but not their individual faith.
I guess what I'm trying to say is, imagine you live in a society where people think that unless you perform these expensive rituals, there will be earthquakes. And you believe that this is complete and utter nonsense. And increasingly, a large segment of the population think that this is complete and utter nonsense. And these people have a history of persecuting people like you, and starting riots and things like that. If you do not think that it is, if you do think that it's complete nonsense and refuse to participate, banning it isn't really that unusual a measure to take, even from a completely neutral perspective, insofar as neutrality exists in religious matters, which it really doesn't. There is no metaphysically neutral point of view. And a lot of the conflict between pagan and Christian was very much tit for tat. For instance, and this is something Bart Ehrman mentions in the book, people talk about how Christians in Alexandria took down the Serapeum. But they forget. But then he points out that, rather conveniently, these pro-pagan people forget to mention that the Serapeum had been used as a citadel by a bunch of pagans who had holed themselves up there and kidnapped Christians throughout the city and forced them to sacrifice or be killed. Yeah. Sorry if I'm...
Well, this gets back into the exclusivity of Christianity and how Christianity is a total worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Because to destroy Christianity, you have to kill every single Christian believer, which is impossible. Or you have to kill them through conversion, convert everyone or kill everyone.
Yeah.
To destroy paganism, you just destroy the sacrifices. If there's nowhere to do the sacrifices, it will decline, because it's not felt within.
Centered. It's entirely centered around the idea that you will get results by performing certain sacrifices.
Yes.
And so once the sacrifices were, as the sacrifices started to disappear, people realized it wasn't really necessary, and then they disappeared.
That being said, we have paganism, Hellenistic paganism, and Greco-Roman paganism continued into the Dark Ages. I believe that Tarsus, they're talking about, this is on Wikipedia at least, that in Greece itself there were Hellenistic pagans into the 9th century.
Yeah, that was on the Mani Peninsula in the very, very southern tip of Laconia, so near Sparta. This was partially because it was inaccessible by land, because of the mountains blocking off the primary access to the Peloponnese.
I know that in St. Gregory the Great's book of Benedict, St. Benedict's biography they wrote of him, it seems that Hellenistic paganism within the Italian peninsula still was a large minority during the 5th century.
In the countryside.
5th and 6th century.
I mean, like we said, the laws against sacrifice couldn't really be enforced because, firstly, Roman law, when an emperor made a decree that wasn't a modern legislative act, where it's permanently encoded into law, and then police officers will take that down and they'll go out from the courts and start enforcing them. They mostly just express the emperor's will, and then governors would then adapt those decrees to local circumstances and pragmatic considerations. And so in practice, it was a lot like how VHSs would have that warning text at the beginning that said that you will be fined $500,000 if you copy this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Laws against sacrifice were kind of like that, where it did far more to express the will of the emperor, the decrees, than and maybe scare some people into stopping, than it reflected actual law that gets enforced as we understand it today.
Well, Theodosius, his decrees were centered around his decrees to convert people were mainly centered around depriving people of their inheritance, right?
Mm-hmm. Various fines and things like that.
So his decrees to convert people to Christianity work the same way that Sharia law converted people to Islam.
Yeah, another thing that should be noted is very few temples show any signs of violent destruction throughout the old Roman Empire. Most are either converted or simply repurposed or abandoned.
Idols were often destroyed, though.
Yes. Although, it's funny because people always think of idols as these priceless works of art. But that's because the ones that have survived are the priceless works of art. A lot of idols were just crude, rustic.
I mean, look at Slavic idols. And I'm not trying to be anti-Slavic now, but they're just these Slavs are awesome. They're just like these very phallic carvings made out of wood.
Yeah. What's interesting is a lot of the accounts of saints destroying idols mention black smoke escaping them. Oh, actually, yeah, this brings me to something else. There is a story, right? One of the things that's really interesting to note is pagans would often convert en masse if an idol was destroyed and there was no immediate divine retribution. Because paganism is so
according to legends in our histories of the saints, the destruction, as you said, with the black smoke coming out, was often miraculous.
Mm-hmm. Like, with Donar's Oak, hit it with your axe once, and then it just falls over despite being a really, really thick oak. Thick. Sorry. I can't help it. I'm sorry.
But, the decline of paganism, to a certain extent, is obscured both by the lack of sources when you get into the Dark Ages, and scribes aren't going to copy. Like Christian, it would be so great if we had against the Galileans, just to see or the actual census of Tiberius. I mean, it would be so great to have those.
You mean the census of Augustus?
Of Augustus, sorry. If we had those, it would be so wonderful to have those documents. But Christian scribes didn't copy them, so we have all this stuff lost.
No. Christians destroyed them all in an orgy of violence because reasons. No.
We'll get to that in a second. Yeah. But all these things are lost, and they're lost to the distance between us and iniquity, lost with the decline of literature in the Dark Ages. But something that we look back hazily now is that all Abrahamic religions and the Abrahamization of Indian continent religions has led to this total view. So we just see that the decline. Christianity is interfaith. Christianity is unified scripture. Christianity is the sacraments. Christianity is the culture of Christianity, the music of Christianity. Islam is this way. Judaism is this way. Once the sacrifices die as a cultural custom, that religion is done. Yeah. There's no interfaith praying to Thor and Wotan and Odin.
You know, no one dwells on the mysteries.
Piran.
You know, no one prays some equivalent of the rosary.
I'll be back in a second. Just a second. Sorry about that. So it's a common pagan talking point about the lack of, as we were talking about the idols before, or the lack of pagan scriptures or pagan sources. That being said, that's an important thing to note too, is that pagans didn't really have scriptures. The Hellenistic pagans didn't have scriptures.
Yeah.
In the sense that you would have a Quran or the Bible or the Talmud today.
Yeah, and
pagans simply didn't have those. They had poetry or epics which took place with their pantheon, but they didn't have what we would describe as scriptures.
Well, they didn't have theology, really.
Mhm.
Which god was what, or which god did what, or was born of what, was something that varied heavily from location to location and from time to time, and has often been called a contrivance of the poets.
Mm-hmm. And then eventually they may have started to develop this with the development of neo-paganism and henotheism. And if Christianity didn't exist, Neoplatonism, what did I say?
You said neo-paganism.
Neoplatonism, sorry. The development of Neoplatonism and the simultaneous but independent development of henotheism. Henotheism is the sole worship of one god within a pagan pantheon, which you consider greater. Most Hindus are henotheists.
Yeah.
Most modern polytheistic religions are henotheists.
And they'll often say, well, these other gods are just a manifestation of this one god.
So if Christianity didn't exist as a force converting people, I believe that henotheistic and neo-paganism...
Neoplatonism.
My tongue. I'm a little tired. I slept like 4 hours last night. But Neoplatonism and henotheism would eventually evolve that religion to be more sophisticated like the modern religions we see today.
Yeah. Of course, it should be noted that when Julian tried to create a imperial pagan religion based on Neoplatonism, a lot of people were very, very confused because you have all these very, very diverse customs, and he's imposing this one understanding onto it. And he's like, what are you doing? And in fact, it's really something that only a Christian emperor only someone raised a Christian could come up with such an idea.
Well, that's what we see within neo-paganism. It becomes influenced by Christianity and modern and Abrahamic religions, in that it's a total system in a way that the ancient pagans were not.
We'll see. Thor wants you to be a white nationalist.
I think there's one topic I want to get on, and if I'm forgetting any topic before we end this, just tell me and we can talk about that too. But that one topic is, had Constantine not converted, would Rome become Christian? That's something that Bart Ehrman talks a lot about in his book.
Yes, and the conclusion is yes, it would have.
Because of the evolutionary advantages and the communitarian advantages of Christianity.
Christianity was growing, not at an implausible rate, but at a very, very fast rate.
Mm-hmm. And it was growing in a vacuum. Because what he said, he compares the numbers of Christianity with the fast growth of, say, Mormons. But Mormons aren't growing in a vacuum of mutually exclusive religions, of non-mutually exclusive religions. Mormons are growing today where there's mutually exclusive religions, right? Mm-hmm. You can't be a Mormon, you can't be a Catholic, and you can't be a Buddhist, and you can't be a Jew, and you can't be a Scientologist.
So Mormonism's structural advantages can only go so far before it will hit another religion with the same structural advantages. Paganism lacking all those structural advantages, and the fact that Christianity was one of the only religions in the empire that had those advantages, allowed it to basically grow indefinitely. The only way you could have really stopped Christianity from becoming dominant by perhaps the end of the 4th century on demographics alone was some kind of, genocide. Or mass
This
persecution.
Yeah, I mean, had God not intervened, right, an indefinite Diocletian persecution would have at least altered Christianity.
Uh-huh.
But that being said, I mean, if God didn't exist in this hypothetical, right, that Christianity isn't the true religion. That being said, it's ironic because I think that traditional paganism wasn't the greatest threat to Christianity. Judaism and Manichaean were, because they're both, or Manichaeans are largely restrictionist too, right?
Yeah, not to the same extent as Christians, but yes.
If we were to see a competitor to Christianity, it would have to be some kind of exclusivistic Neoplatonism or Manichaeanism, where the real competitors. Traditional Roman or Hellenistic paganism.
Zoroastrianism was actually kind of like that in Persia. It was not totalistic, but it did demand adherence to a much stronger extent than the paganism in the Roman Empire. And,
yeah, so
it has scriptures, for example.
Sorry, neo-pagans, but evolutionarily speaking, traditional Hellenistic paganism is a very weak religion.
Yeah, and it would cease to be Hellenistic paganism or anything like that if you were to modify it to be able to compete structurally.
Yes. If there was no Christian triumph, there would have been a Manichaean Roman Empire or a Manichaean West or a Neoplatonist religious West or something, or even a, God forbid, a totally Jewish West.
Oh God. Oh, that's great.
But that's the truth, though.
Who knows? Maybe a Buddhist West or a Zoroastrian West.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all just very interesting. One thing to note is, you did have currents that opposed sacrifice and some of the rituals among pagan intellectuals, and Christianity just kind of took the step of, we're just going to ban this stuff because it's superstitious and because it's dysfunctional.
Something that's kind of interesting too is that because of Christianity's Jewish element, that allowed Christianity to have a huge amount of legitimacy, because legitimacy was gained in the ancient world by iniquity.
Antiquity of religion, yeah.
Yes. Something that I don't think Manichaeanism could have competed with.
Well, Manichaeanism did have some roots in Zoroastrianism, but you're more or less right. And the tremendous antiquity of Judaism is one of the reasons why the Romans tolerated it. The idea being that if a religion has stood the test of time, the gods must not hate you that much.
Didn't the development of modern Pharisaical or Talmudic Judaism was pretty complete by the 2nd century or the 3rd century?
I think so, yeah.
So they would have became an ethnic religion at that point.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't have been a threat to the order that Christianity was, because the existential threat that led to the persecutions, we touched on this a little bit, is the idea that the gods constantly need sacrifices or they'll be vengeful and destroy Rome.
Yes. Diocletian's goal was basically to crack down on any religious non-observance, as he saw it, because of the chaos that he had just escaped through, his vigorous and fairly competent rule. And he was like, okay, I'm going to crack down on anyone who's not doing their sacrifices, because I think the reason everything is going wrong is because people haven't been doing their sacrifices. And the gods are punishing us.
So, is there anything else you want to cover?
No, not really.
So, I'm glad that you could come on. He just started his channel. He has his first video up. Holy
Yeah.
Roman and Empire, right?
And Imperial, yeah.
Oh yeah, Imperial. It's a
Yeah.
pretty good video. You should go check it out. Hopefully, he's gonna make some videos about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth soon.
Yeah. Well, my next video is going to come out before New Year, and it's
Okay.
going to be about the Electoral College of the Empire and how it developed and originated.
Okay. I'll see you guys later.